Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You know that moment when everything just clicks, when the years of subtle neglect, the overlooked achievements, and the quiet dismissals all come crashing down into a single, defining second? I had mine on a warm Sunday afternoon, standing on my parents' driveway, watching my younger brother Jake beam with excitement as they handed him the keys to a brand new car. The paint gleamed under the sunlight, a deep midnight blue, the kind of color that screamed luxury. My father clapped him on the back, my mother wiped away an emotional tear, and I stood there, waiting. Not for my own set of keys, I was too old to believe in miracles, but for some sort of acknowledgement that I existed. That maybe, just maybe, they'd realize how unfair this was. I waited for someone to turn to me and say, "Hey, Emily, you worked hard. You deserve something too." But that moment never came. Instead, my mother sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her chest like she'd just watched the most touching moment of her life. "He deserves it," she said, her voice full of pride. "He's worked so hard." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Worked so hard? At what? Skipping classes to hang out with his friends? Barely scraping by in college because my parents paid for every single expense, while I had to work part-time just to afford books. I blinked, feeling my nails dig into my palm. And I didn't? I finally asked, my voice calm but sharp. My father, who had been laughing with Jake, turned to me with a blank expression, as if he had completely forgotten I was standing there. "It's different," he said, his voice even. "You always figured things out on your own." I stared at him, waiting for more. Some kind of justification that made sense. But that was it. That was the whole explanation. Jake, completely oblivious to the tension, ran his hand over the hood of his new car, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Man, this is sick," he said, already pulling his phone out to take pictures. "You guys are the best." Something in me snapped. It wasn't the car itself, it was everything leading up to this moment. The years of being the responsible one, the one who didn't ask for much, the one who figured things out on her own. It was realizing that, no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would always come second to Jake. I felt my lips curl into a tight smile. Right. Of course. My mother sighed again, as if she was already exhausted by the conversation. "Sweetheart, it's just. Jake needed this. You've always been independent. You never needed help like he did." I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a slow breath, nodding as if I understood. "Got it," I said, my voice eerily calm. Then I turned on my heel and walked back inside, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. That was the moment. The moment I decided I was done being the afterthought. If they thought Jake deserved a car more than me, then fine. Let him have his shiny new toy. I wasn't going to waste another second waiting for my parents to recognize my worth. I was going to show them. And when I did, they were going to regret ever underestimating me. The day I decided to buy my own car, I knew it had to be something that would turn heads, something that would make a statement so loud my parents would have no choice but to acknowledge it. I worked longer hours, took every extra shift I could, sacrificed my weekends, and cut out every unnecessary expense from my life. While my friends were out drinking and traveling, I was grinding away, knowing that every single dollar I saved was another step closer to proving my point. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about everything it represented. The independence, the success, the fact that I was never going to let them tell me I wasn't good enough again. The months passed slowly, but with each paycheck, my savings grew, and with each deposit, my determination solidified. I watched Jake show off his car on social media, watched my parents dote on him like he had done something extraordinary simply by existing. It was infuriating, but it only pushed me harder. When the day finally came and I walked into the dealership with enough money to put a down payment on the car of my dreams, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete and utter satisfaction. I chose a sleek black luxury car, one that made Jake's look like a toy in comparison. It was smooth, powerful, and every inch of it exuded success. When I ran my hand over the pristine surface before signing the papers, I imagined the look on my parents' faces when they saw it. Imagine their stunned silence, and it fueled me even more. Driving home that day was one of the best moments of my life. The engine purred beneath me, the leather seats molded perfectly to my back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own narrative. The moment I pulled into the driveway, my mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening in disbelief as she took in the sight of the car. She called for my father, and within seconds, he was stepping out onto the porch, his expression unreadable as he took a long look at the vehicle parked in their driveway. Jake wasn't home yet, which was a shame because I would have loved to see his reaction first, but my parents' stunned silence was already a victory in itself. My mother took a hesitant step forward, her eyes flicking between me and the car like she was struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "Emily," she started, her voice softer than usual. "Whose car is this?" I leaned against the hood, crossing my arms as I met her gaze with a smirk. "Mine," I said simply, watching as the confusion in her face twisted into something else, something closer to discomfort. My father let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if he refused to believe it. "How did you afford that?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism, as if the idea of me having something this nice on my own terms was impossible. I shrugged, keeping my expression calm even though I wanted to revel in their disbelief. "Worked for it," I said, letting the words hang in the air just long enough for the weight of them to settle. "Took extra shifts, saved up, and bought it myself." My mother blinked rapidly, her hand moving to her chest as if she was trying to collect herself. "Well, it's very nice," she said, her tone forced and awkward. "A little flashy, don't you think?" I tilted my head, feigning thoughtfulness before replying, "Not any flashier than Jake's." There it was, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together like she was trying to hold something back. I had hit the nerve I wanted to hit, and it felt damn good. Then, as if on cue, her expression softened into something almost sweet, something I recognized instantly: manipulation. "You know," she said, her voice suddenly light and casual, "we were just talking about taking a trip out of town next weekend. Would be nice to take a drive somewhere scenic, don't you think?" I stared at her for a long moment, my amusement growing as I realized exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just making conversation. She was testing the waters, planting the idea in my head so that I'd be the one to offer her what she really wanted. She wanted a ride. She wanted to sit in the car she had never believed I could own. She wanted to be driven around in luxury without ever acknowledging that I had done something worth celebrating. I smiled at her, slow and deliberate, before pushing off the hood and walking around to the driver's side. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to say something, to offer her exactly what she was hinting at. Instead, I opened the door, slipped inside, and without a single word, started the engine. As the car roared to life, I glanced at her through the windshield, taking in the way her face fell just slightly, the way her hand, still held against her chest, tightened into a fist. She looked humiliated, and for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt about it. Then, without hesitation, I put the car in reverse, turned the wheel, and drove away, leaving her standing there with nothing but the sound of my tires on the pavement. The silence at home didn't last long after I drove away that day, though for a brief, satisfying moment, I had let myself believe they might actually process the situation and reflect on their behavior. Of course, that was wishful thinking, because within 24 hours, the comments started trickling in, small at first, little remarks disguised as casual observations, but soaked in passive-aggressive judgment. My mother, the queen of pretending she wasn't insulting you while doing exactly that, made sure to comment every time I walked through the door, her voice just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that she could feign innocence if confronted. "Oh, look who's home," she said one evening as I stepped inside, kicking off my shoes by the door. Miss Luxury herself, coming down from her throne to mingle with the common folk. I ignored her, as I had been doing for days, but my father wasn't as subtle in his approach. He scoffed every time he caught sight of my car through the window, muttering under his breath about how some people just love throwing money away, and how flashing wealth doesn't make you successful. The irony of those words coming from the same man who had gifted my brother a brand new car while dismissing my existence wasn't lost on me, but I didn't bother engaging. Jake, however, was the most entertaining of all. At first, he didn't say much, and for a second, I thought maybe he was too self-absorbed to care. But then I started noticing the shift, the way he suddenly felt the need to bring up his own car in every conversation, as if reminding himself and everyone else that he was still special, still the golden boy. He'd casually mention how fast it was, how smooth the ride felt, how much attention he got when he pulled up to school. It would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. It wasn't until I overheard a conversation between him and one of his friends that I realized just how deeply my new car had gotten under his skin. They were standing in the kitchen while I was in the hallway, just out of sight, and his friend was laughing in a way that made me pause. "Dude, I'm not gonna lie," the guy chuckled. "Her car makes yours look like a damn go-kart." Jake's voice was tight when he replied, forced into something resembling amusement, but clearly irritated underneath. "Man, hers is all about looks," he scoffed. "Mine's got better performance, better handling, just overall a better driving experience." His friend snorted. "Yeah, sure, man. Keep telling yourself that." I didn't even try to hide my smirk as I walked past the kitchen, watching Jake's expression twist the second he realized I had heard everything. He glared at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, but I just kept walking, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in my chest. It didn't take long before my parents decided to change tactics. The insults and the passive aggression clearly weren't working, so they tried a different approach, one they had used many times before, one that had worked on me as a child but held no power over me now. Guilt. "You know, Emily," my mother started one evening as I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, "family is about supporting each other, not about trying to prove a point." I didn't even glance up. "Is that so?" "Yes, it is," she continued, her tone light, almost rehearsed, like she had been waiting for the perfect moment to deliver this little speech. "And in this family, we help each other. We don't act selfishly just to make a statement." I sighed, finally looking at her with a deadpan expression. "Just say what you want to say, Mom." She blinked, clearly thrown off by my directness, but she recovered quickly. "Jake's been struggling with a few things lately," she said, her voice laced with fake sympathy. "He's been under a lot of pressure at school, and it might be nice if you let him borrow your car every once in a while, just to make things a little easier for him." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the absurdity of what she was asking fully sink in before I responded. Then, unable to stop myself, I burst out laughing. It wasn't just a small chuckle or a quiet scoff, it was a full, unrestrained laugh, the kind that comes from deep in your gut when you hear something so absolutely ridiculous that you can't help but react. My father, who had been sitting silently in his chair, snapped his newspaper down onto the table with an irritated sigh. "What the hell's so funny?" he snapped, glaring at me. I wiped a non-existent tear from my eye, shaking my head as I met his gaze. "You," I said simply. "Both of you. This whole situation. It's hilarious." My mother frowned, clearly not understanding what I found so amusing. "Emily, I don't see what's so funny about being part of a family that supports each other." "Neither do I replied, leaning back against the couch, my amusement fading into something sharper. "But see, that's the thing, you don't actually support me, do you? You never have. You didn't support me when I was working myself to exhaustion, you didn't support me when I asked why Jake got a car and I didn't, and you sure as hell aren't supporting me now. What you want is for me to keep playing the role of the convenient, self-sufficient daughter who never asks for anything but gives when it's demanded." My father scoffed, shaking his head as he picked his newspaper back up. "You're being dramatic," he muttered, flipping a page. I grinned, tilting my head. "Am I? Or are you just mad that you can't control me the way you do Jake?" That got his attention. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment there was nothing but thick, suffocating tension between us. Then, just when I thought he might try to argue, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he muttered under his breath. "Ungrateful little brat." I smiled, slow and triumphant, because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I stood. The air in the house had been thick with tension ever since that last conversation, an unspoken battle line drawn between me and my parents, neither side willing to concede. They had always been able to manipulate me into feeling guilty, into believing that somehow I was the selfish one, that my refusal to bend to their demands made me the problem. But something had shifted this time, something fundamental had cracked, and no amount of guilt-tripping or forced pleasantries could put things back the way they were. I could feel it every time I walked into the room, the way my mother's lips pursed just slightly when she saw me, the way my father's eyes would flick toward me but never hold my gaze for long. Jake, on the other hand, had stopped even pretending to hide his irritation, his once cocky demeanor giving way to sulking silence whenever I was around. He had always been the golden child, the one who had everything handed to him without question, and now, for the first time in his life, he was watching someone else take the spotlight. It all came to a head one evening when my mother, in her usual overly sweet and carefully calculated way, made a suggestion that wasn't really a suggestion at all. We were thinking about taking a little road trip, she said casually as she set the dinner table, her voice deliberately light, like she was just throwing the idea out there. Nothing too far, maybe a few hours upstate. Would be nice to have a family getaway, just the four of us, spending some quality time together. I didn't bother looking up from my plate, already sensing where this was going. Sounds fun, I said dryly, stabbing a piece of food with my fork. My mother continued as if I hadn't spoken. Jake's car isn't really meant for long drives, you know, she added, her voice dipping into that concerned, motherly tone she used when she was trying to manipulate someone. It's not the most comfortable for road trips, and we don't want to put too many miles on it so soon. We were thinking, well, since your car is so spacious and reliable, maybe we could take yours instead. I let the silence stretch between us, enjoying the way she fidgeted slightly when I didn't immediately respond. Finally, I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I studied her. So let me get this straight, I said slowly, my voice deliberately calm. You want to take my car, the one I worked for, the one I paid for, and use it for a trip I wasn't even asked if I wanted to go on? My father, who had been silent until now, folded his arms and sighed heavily, his patience already thinning. Emily, it's not that deep, he muttered. It's just a car. That was when I laughed, loud and unrestrained, because the audacity of it all was truly incredible. Oh, it's just a car now? I said, shaking my head in disbelief. Funny, because when Jake got his, it wasn't just a car, was it? It was a reward. It was something he deserved. But mine? Mine is just a car, something that should be shared because it's convenient for you. My mother sighed dramatically, as if I was being exhausting. Emily, we're family, she said, pressing her lips together like she was trying to be patient. If you really loved this family, you'd share. It's not about ownership, it's about doing something nice for the people who love you. I tilted my head, feeling something cold settle in my chest. If you really loved me, I said, my voice quiet but sharp, you would have treated me like family in the first place. The silence that followed was heavy, a moment of absolute stillness in which I knew, without a doubt, that nothing would ever be the same. My father's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on the table, while my mother simply stared at me, her face unreadable. Jake, for once, didn't say anything, but the smug satisfaction he usually carried was nowhere to be found. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow scrape against the floor, my decision already made before I had even fully formed the thought. I'm done, I said, my voice steady, controlled. I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm not sitting here, pretending that any of this is normal. You don't respect me, you don't appreciate me, and I'm done pretending like I owe you anything just because we share DNA. My mother's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if she was about to protest, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned on my heel and walked toward the stairs, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with certainty. I packed my bags that night, throwing clothes into a suitcase with a kind of energy that was almost exhilarating. There had been so many times I had thought about leaving, so many moments I had swallowed my anger just to keep the peace, but this time, I wasn't backing down. When I walked out of the house the next morning, neither of my parents tried to stop me. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. My mother stood with her arms crossed, her expression cold, and Jake sat at the counter, pretending to be unbothered. Not a single one of them apologized. Not one of them admitted they had been wrong. I didn't need them to. I tossed my bags into my car, slid into the driver's seat, and without hesitation, pulled out of the driveway, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. Weeks passed, and I settled into my new reality, one where I didn't have to tiptoe around my parents' expectations, one where I was in control of my own life. They didn't call, and I didn't reach out, but the silence didn't bother me the way I thought it might. If anything, it was a relief. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed with an incoming call, the name flashing on the screen making my stomach tighten. Mom. I let it ring for a moment, debating whether I even wanted to pick up, but curiosity got the best of me. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. There was a long pause, then her voice, quiet, calculated. We need to talk. When I agreed to meet my mother, I told myself I was only doing it out of curiosity, not out of hope, not out of some misguided desire to mend things that had been broken long before I even realized they were cracked. I had spent too much of my life waiting for people who would never change, hoping for apologies that would never come, and I refused to let myself believe that this time would be any different. But still, when I saw her sitting across from me at the small cafe she had chosen, looking composed and calculated as ever, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, something that almost felt like disappointment. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't regretful. She wasn't acting like a mother desperate to fix things with her daughter. She was sitting with her hands folded neatly on the table, a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched, her lips pursed in that way they always did when she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like. I didn't say anything as I sat down, placing my keys on the table with an intentional slowness, the metallic jingle cutting through the silence between us. She watched the motion carefully, her eyes flickering from the expensive key fob to my face, and something about that small reaction made my stomach twist. Emily, she started, her voice even, controlled, carrying none of the warmth or hesitation that a mother should have when speaking to the daughter she hadn't seen in weeks. I'll be direct with you, because I know how much you hate small talk. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest as I let out a quiet breath. That's a first, I said, tilting my head slightly. Go ahead. Be direct. She exhaled sharply, as if bracing herself, but the way she straightened her spine told me she was confident in what she was about to say. Your father and I are in a bit of financial trouble, she admitted, her voice carefully neutral. We took out a loan for Jake's car, and with the way things have been going lately, we're struggling to keep up with the payments. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the moment when she would acknowledge how absolutely insane it was that she was sitting in front of me asking for help with something so unbelievably audacious. But there was no hesitation in her expression, no awareness of the irony of her words, no shame in the fact that she had spent years dismissing me only to come crawling now that she needed something. So let me get this straight, I said slowly, my voice calm but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. You took out a loan for Jake's car because he deserved it more, right? And now that you can't afford to keep up with it, you want me to fix the mess you created. Her lips pressed together in that familiar tight line, the one she always made when she realized she had miscalculated something but didn't want to admit it. Emily, she said, carefully choosing her words, we're family. And family helps each other, especially when one of us is in a position to do so. You're successful now, you've made good money, and I don't think it's unreasonable to ask you to step in and help during a difficult time. I let out a breath, shaking my head slightly as I tried to process the sheer audacity of what she was saying. You didn't think I deserved help when I needed it, I pointed out, my voice steady but firm. You didn't offer to support me when I was working my ass off to afford my own car, when I was scraping by while Jake was handed everything without question. And now, suddenly, I owe you. She exhaled through her nose, her patience wearing thin, but she still kept that same controlled tone, the same calculated expression, like she truly believed she could still manipulate me into doing what she wanted. "This isn't about owing anyone," she said smoothly. "This is about doing the right thing." A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat before I could stop it, and I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table as I met her gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "Funny," I murmured, letting the word hang in the air for a moment, just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "I thought Jake deserved things more than I did." She flinched, just barely, but I caught it, and for the first time in this entire conversation, she actually looked like she was at a loss for words. I didn't give her the chance to recover. I reached for my keys, running my fingers over them before tossing them lightly into the air, catching them effortlessly as I stood up. The motion was casual, dismissive, a silent but undeniable statement that I wasn't buying into her bullshit anymore. "Good luck with that loan, Mom," I said as I pushed my chair back, my voice calm, even. "But you'll have to figure it out without me." She didn't call my name. She didn't beg. She didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, frozen, watching as I walked away without a second glance. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around me, and I took a deep breath, letting it settle into my lungs as I unlocked my car and slid inside. The leather was warm beneath my hands, the hum of the engine steady and familiar as I turned the key. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, the screen lighting up with a call from home, the same number that had been ignored so many times before. I didn't even have to think about it. I smirked, shaking my head slightly as I reached over, flipped the phone face down, and pressed my foot against the gas. I didn't need them anymore. And for the first time in my life, I was completely and utterly free.